Caroline and Michael Hartwell had been trying for a baby for 11 years. 11 years of hope and disappointment, of fertility treatments and failed procedures, of watching friends and siblings have children while their own nursery remained empty. They had painted it 3 times, changing colors with each new treatment cycle, as if fresh paint might break the curse that seemed to hang over them. First yellow for optimism, then green for growth, finally a soft gray that matched their resigned acceptance that parenthood might never happen. They lived in a Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, a town famous for its dark history and October tourists who came to experience the Halloween atmosphere that permeated every season. Caroline taught literature at the local high school, spending her days surrounded by other people's children, coming home to silence. That October, as Salem prepared for its annual Halloween festivities and tourists flooded the streets in witch costumes, Caroline hit her lowest point. She was 42 years old, and her window for pregnancy was closing rapidly. Michael was 45, trying to hide his own grief to be strong for her, but she could see it in his eyes every time he looked at the empty nursery, at the crib they'd bought years ago that had never held a baby. On October 13th, a Friday, Caroline received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, and the envelope was made of thick, expensive paper that felt almost like fabric. Inside was a simple card with embossed text inviting her and Michael to a consultation with Dr. Lazarus Thorne, a fertility specialist who had recently opened a practice in Salem and claimed to have extraordinary success rates with seemingly hopeless cases. The address was for a building in the historic district, one of those old colonial structures that tourists photographed constantly. Caroline showed the letter to Michael, and they discussed it with the wariness of people who had been disappointed too many times. It was probably a scam, probably someone preying on desperate couples. But what if it wasn't? What if this was their last chance, their final hope before accepting that parenthood would never happen? They called the number on the card and scheduled an appointment for October 20th. The voice on the phone was professional and soothing, assuring them that Dr. Thorne had helped many couples in their exact situation, that there were options they hadn't yet explored, that hope was not lost. Caroline hung up feeling something she hadn't felt in years, cautious optimism, the dangerous flutter of possibility. The office of Dr. Lazarus Thorne was located in a building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1800s. Dark wood paneling, antique medical equipment displayed in glass cases, oil paintings of stern-faced physicians from centuries past. The waiting room was empty, though the receptionist assured them that Dr. Thorne was very selective about his clients, preferring to work with couples who truly deserved the gift of parenthood. Dr. Thorne himself was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to see through pretense and social niceties straight to the desperate hope underneath. He invited Caroline and Michael into his consultation room, which was filled with books on fertility and reproduction, some of them clearly very old, bound in leather that looked disturbingly organic. He listened to their story with what seemed like genuine compassion, taking notes in a leather journal with a fountain pen that looked like an antique. When they finished, he closed the journal and explained his approach, which he called alternative conception therapy. Traditional medicine, he said, focused on the mechanical aspects of reproduction, hormones, timing, physical health. But there were other factors, metaphysical elements that modern science ignored or dismissed. Dr. Thorne believed that conception required not just physical compatibility but spiritual alignment, that some couples couldn't conceive because their desires weren't strong enough to pierce the veil between potential and reality. His treatment involved focused intention, specific rituals performed at astrologically significant times, and certain herbal preparations that had been used for centuries before modern medicine dismissed them as superstition. Michael was skeptical, his architect's practical mind rejecting what sounded like mysticism and pseudoscience. But Caroline felt something stirring, not rational belief but desperate hope, the willingness to try anything after 11 years of failure. Dr. Thorne seemed to sense the dynamic between them and focused his attention on Caroline, explaining that the treatment required absolute commitment from both partners but especially from the mother, who would be the vessel for the new life. The cost was substantial, $50,000, all of it due up front, with no guarantee of success, though Dr. Thorne claimed he'd never failed with a couple who followed his protocol exactly. They would need to sign a contract agreeing to follow his instructions precisely, to complete certain rituals at specific times, to use his herbal preparations according to a strict schedule. If they deviated from the protocol, even slightly, he couldn't be responsible for the results. Dr. Thorne spread the contract out on his desk, and it was written on the same thick, fabric-like paper as the invitation. The language was archaic, full of phrases like "parties of the first part" and "herein stipulated conditions." There were clauses about maintaining confidentiality, following the prescribed treatment exactly, and accepting full responsibility for any outcomes, whether expected or unexpected. Caroline and Michael took the contract home to review, and they spent 3 days arguing about it. Michael thought it was clearly a scam, that Dr. Thorne was preying on desperate people with pseudoscientific nonsense. Caroline pointed out that they'd already spent over $100,000 on conventional treatments that had failed, that $50,000 for even a small chance was worth it, that they were running out of time and options. On October 24th, 1 week before Halloween, they returned to Dr. Thorne's office and signed the contract. Caroline's signature was firm and decisive. Michael's was reluctant, the handwriting of a man who was going along with something against his better judgment. Dr. Thorne witnessed their signatures with that same fountain pen, and the moment the ink dried, he smiled with what looked like satisfaction and told them to prepare for the first ritual, which would take place on Halloween night at exactly 3:33 a.m. The instructions Dr. Thorne provided were specific and strange. On Halloween night, Caroline and Michael were to prepare their bedroom with black candles at each corner, with specific herbs burning in a censer, plants with names Caroline didn't recognize, that Dr. Thorne provided in small cloth bags that smelled of earth and decay. They were to fast from midnight until the ritual, drinking only water mixed with a tincture Dr. Thorne had prepared. At 3:33 a.m., they were to perform what Dr. Thorne called a conception ceremony, essentially making love according to specific instructions, with certain words spoken at certain moments, with the candles and herbs creating an atmosphere that felt more like a seance than a fertility treatment. The whole thing made Michael extremely uncomfortable, but Caroline insisted they follow the protocol exactly as prescribed. Halloween night arrived cold and clear, with a full moon hanging over Salem like a spotlight. The streets were filled with revelers and tourists, but inside the Hartwell house, Caroline and Michael prepared for their strange ritual with a mixture of embarrassment and desperate hope. They lit the black candles at exactly 3:30 a.m., started the herbs burning, and drank the tincture that tasted like bitter metal and old earth. At 3:33 a.m., they began the ceremony, and something in the room changed. The air felt thicker, charged with energy that made the candle flames dance and the shadows move in ways that didn't match any logical light source. Michael would later say he felt like they weren't alone, like something was watching from the corners where darkness pooled deepest. But they continued, following Dr. Thorne's instructions, speaking the words he'd written out for them, completing the ritual exactly as prescribed. When it was over, the candles all went out simultaneously, though there had been no wind. The herbs stopped burning as if smothered by an invisible hand. The room was suddenly cold enough that they could see their breath, and Caroline felt something she'd never felt before, a certainty, deep in her body, that something had changed, that the ritual had worked in ways they couldn't yet understand. 3 weeks later, Caroline took a pregnancy test, and for the first time in 11 years, it came back positive. Then another test confirmed it, and another. She called Dr. Thorne's office, and he congratulated her warmly, telling her to continue taking the herbal preparations he provided, to avoid conventional prenatal care until the second trimester, to trust the process that had begun on Halloween night. Michael wanted her to see a regular obstetrician immediately, but Caroline refused, terrified that conventional medicine would somehow interfere with whatever Dr. Thorne had done, that deviating from his protocol would cause her to lose this miracle baby. They argued about it, but Caroline was adamant, and Michael eventually gave in, watching her follow Dr. Thorne's increasingly strange instructions with growing unease. The pregnancy progressed normally, at least by the standards of the home tests and measurements Caroline performed under Dr. Thorne's guidance. Her belly grew, the baby moved, and every visit to Dr. Thorne's office confirmed that everything was developing as it should. But there were oddities. Caroline sometimes woke in the night feeling like the baby was moving in ways that didn't match any of the pregnancy books, like it was doing something more complex than just kicking or turning. Caroline gave birth on July 31st, exactly 9 months after the Halloween ritual, at home as Dr. Thorne had insisted. He attended the birth himself along with a midwife who never spoke, just assisted with practiced efficiency. The labor was surprisingly quick and easy, and when their daughter emerged into the world, she was perfect, tiny and pink and wailing with healthy lungs, 10 fingers and 10 toes. Everything exactly as it should be. They named her Lily, and for the first few weeks, she was everything they dreamed of. She nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, gazed at them with dark eyes that seemed unusually alert for a newborn. Caroline and Michael fell completely in love, amazed that this perfect creature had come from their bodies, that after 11 years of emptiness, their house was finally filled with the sounds of a baby. Dr. Thorne visited weekly, checking on Lily's development, providing more of his herbal preparations that he said would ensure she stayed healthy and strong. He seemed particularly interested in her sleep patterns, asking detailed questions about when she slept, how deeply, whether she ever woke at specific times. Caroline thought the questions were odd but assumed they were part of his unorthodox medical approach. The first incident happened when Lily was 3 weeks old. Caroline woke at 3:33 a.m., the same time as the conception ritual, with the sudden certainty that something was wrong. She rushed to the nursery and found Lily's crib empty, the baby gone, the blankets undisturbed as if she'd simply vanished. Caroline screamed for Michael, and they tore through the house in panic, calling 911, preparing for the worst. But then, at 3:45 a.m., Lily was simply back in her crib, lying exactly where she should have been, sleeping peacefully. Caroline was sure she'd checked that crib, had looked right at the empty mattress, but Michael convinced her she must have been half asleep, confused, that Lily had been there the whole time. They canceled the 911 call, embarrassed, chalking it up to new parent exhaustion and paranoia. Except it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., Caroline would wake and find Lily gone from her crib, only for the baby to reappear 12 minutes later at 3:45. Michael installed a baby monitor with video, determined to catch what was happening, to prove that either Caroline was sleepwalking and imagining it or something genuinely impossible was occurring. The video from the monitor showed something that shouldn't have been possible. At 3:33 a.m. precisely, Lily would simply disappear from the frame, not moving out of the crib but vanishing as if she'd never existed. The empty crib would remain on screen for exactly 12 minutes. Then, at 3:45, Lily would reappear in the same position, as if she'd never left. There was no transition, no gradual fading, just presence, then absence, then presence again. More disturbing were the changes when Lily returned. At first they were subtle, a small scratch on her arm that hadn't been there before, a red mark on her cheek like she'd been poked by something sharp. But as weeks passed, the marks got worse. Deep scratches that looked like claw marks. Bruises in the shape of small handprints. Bite marks that were too small to be from an adult but too vicious to be from another baby. Caroline and Michael brought her to a pediatrician, frantic with worry, and the doctor examined the marks with growing concern. The injuries were consistent with abuse, he said carefully, watching their reactions. Were there any other caregivers? Any situations where Lily was left unsupervised? Michael tried to explain about the nightly disappearances, but the words sounded insane even to him, and he stopped, seeing the suspicion growing in the doctor's eyes. They left before Child Protective Services could be called, taking Lily home and sealing themselves in the house, too terrified to seek help because any explanation that included their baby vanishing every night would result in her being taken away. They called Dr. Thorne, desperate for answers, but his office number was disconnected, and when they went to his building, they found it empty and abandoned, as if no one had ever practiced medicine there. Michael started researching obsessively, trying to understand what they'd gotten themselves into. He dug into the contract they'd signed, analyzing the archaic language with the help of a lawyer friend who owed him a favor. What they found was terrifying. The contract's language, carefully examined, wasn't actually about fertility treatment at all. It was about borrowing something, about temporary custody, and shared access, and visitation rights. The specific phrase that made Michael's blood run cold was in the fine print he'd barely glanced at when signing. The biological parents acknowledge that the child shall be subject to dual custody arrangements, with primary residence in the mortal realm but mandatory visitation to the realm of origin during hours specified herein, specifically between 3:33 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. daily, with extended visitation rights on significant calendar dates including but not limited to All Hallows Eve. They had signed away visitation rights to their own child. To whom, to what, the contract didn't specify, but the implications were horrifying. Lily disappeared every night because something else had custody of her during those 12 minutes, taking her somewhere they couldn't see or follow, a place where she was being hurt, marked, traumatized in ways they couldn't prevent or protect her from. Caroline tried to break the pattern. She held Lily during the 3:33 window, gripping her daughter tightly, refusing to let go. But at 3:33 precisely, Lily vanished from her arms, simply ceased to exist in Caroline's grip, leaving her holding empty air. When Lily returned 12 minutes later, she was screaming, and the scratches on her face were deeper than ever, as if whatever had her had been angry at the attempt to interfere. They tried to keep Lily awake through the window, stimulating her, playing with her, doing everything possible to prevent her from being taken. But at 3:33 Lily would suddenly go rigid, her eyes rolling back, and then she would vanish regardless of her waking state. When she returned, she would be limp and unresponsive for minutes, and the marks on her body were even worse, as if the entities that had her were punishing them for their interference. Michael found records of Dr. Lazarus Thorne going back centuries, not the same person, that would be impossible, but the name appearing again and again in historical documents about unexplained pregnancies and children born under unusual circumstances. A Dr. Thorne in Salem during the witch trials, helping barren women conceive children who later exhibited strange behaviors. A Dr. Thorne in Victorian London, running a fertility clinic where babies were born healthy but never lived past their 7th birthday. A Dr. Thorne in 1960s New Orleans, helping couples desperate for children and then disappearing after the babies began to manifest disturbing abilities. The pattern was clear. Dr. Thorne, or whatever used that name, had been making these contracts for centuries, helping desperate couples conceive children who were only partly human, who belonged partially to whatever realm Lily visited during her nightly disappearances. Caroline found an online forum, buried deep in the internet, where parents discussed children with similar issues. They used coded language, talking about special needs and unusual sleeping patterns, but reading between the lines, it was clear they were all dealing with the same thing. Children who disappeared at specific times, who came back marked and traumatized, who were slowly being claimed by something that had provided the biological template for their existence. The forum parents had tried everything, blessed medallions, protective circles, moving to different houses, even attempting to reverse the contracts through legal or occult means. Nothing worked. The contracts were binding in ways that transcended normal reality, and the children's dual nature couldn't be changed or separated. They were partly human, but they were also partly something else, and that other part had rights that superseded parental authority. As Lily approached her first birthday, the nightly visitations became more traumatic. She would return from the 3:33 disappearances not just scratched and bruised but fundamentally changed. Her eyes would be darker, her expressions less human, her movements occasionally jerky and unnatural as if she was remembering how to inhabit her own body. She stopped making normal baby sounds and began making noises that hurt to hear, vocalizations that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wrong. The marks on her body evolved from simple scratches to patterns that looked deliberate, like symbols being carved into her skin. They would fade by morning, but Michael photographed them, and when he researched the symbols online, he found matches in obscure occult texts, marks associated with various demonic entities, sigils used in summoning rituals, brands that indicated ownership or allegiance. Lily was being claimed, slowly and systematically, by whatever forces Dr. Thorne represented. Every nightly visitation took her a little further from humanity, marked her a little more clearly as belonging to something else. By the time she turned 2, she barely seemed to recognize Caroline and Michael during the day, looking at them with alien confusion as if trying to remember why these humans were important to her. The whispers started around Lily's 2nd birthday. Caroline would hear them when she put Lily down for naps, not coming from the baby but from around her, from the air itself, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The voices seemed to be calling to Lily, reminding her of something, pulling at her identity and trying to reshape it into something that could exist in multiple realities simultaneously. Michael found evidence that other Thorn babies, as he started calling them, didn't typically survive past age 7. The forum posts from parents of older children would suddenly stop, the accounts going silent, and when Michael tried to track down these families, he found obituaries for children who had died in mysterious circumstances, unexplained illnesses, sudden accidents, disappearances where bodies were never found. The children weren't dying, he realized with horror. They were being taken permanently, transitioning fully to whatever realm they visited nightly, leaving the mortal world behind entirely. They had 5 years, maybe less, before Lily would be claimed completely. 5 years to find a way to break the contract, to sever the connection between their daughter and the entities that had provided the template for her existence. 5 years to somehow save a child who was only partly theirs, who had been designed from conception to be a bridge between worlds, a being that see. Caroline descended into depression, barely able to function, watching her miracle baby slowly transform into something that wasn't entirely a baby anymore. Michael threw himself into research, contacting occultists and demonologists, tracking down other parents who had dealt with similar situations, trying to find anyone who had successfully broken free from these contracts. He found one lead, a woman in Boston who claimed her daughter had been a Thorn baby but was now a normal 25-year-old. Michael drove to Boston immediately, desperate for hope, and found the woman living in a small apartment filled with religious iconography from multiple traditions. She told him her story. Her daughter had been claimed just like Lily, marked and traumatized by nightly visitations. But on the child's 7th birthday, something unexpected had happened during an extended Halloween visitation. The catch, Margaret explained, was that her daughter was never entirely normal afterward. She had memories of the place she'd visited nightly for 7 years, carried trauma from whatever she'd experienced there, and occasionally still manifested abilities that weren't quite human, knowing things she shouldn't know, seeing things that weren't visible to others, existing slightly out of sync with normal reality. But she was alive, was human enough to have a life, had escaped the permanent claiming that was supposed to have occurred. Michael asked how to replicate this, how to create the same protective sanctuary for Lily. Margaret's answer was both simple and impossible. On Lily's 7th Halloween, during the extended visitation that would last from sunset to sunrise rather than the usual 12 minutes, other Thorn children would come to them. They always did on the 7th Halloween, seeking refuge, trying to escape permanent claiming. But Margaret warned him, the entities would come for the children. The parents who had made these contracts would face the beings they'd bargained with, and those beings would be angry, violent, desperate to collect what they believed they owned. Many parents couldn't face that confrontation, couldn't protect children who weren't biologically theirs, couldn't risk everything for strangers' kids. Those parents lost their own children along with all the others, watched them all disappear permanently, transitioning to the dark realm and never returning. Michael drove back to Salem with this information, this impossible task ahead of them. They spent those 3 years preparing. Caroline recovered from her depression, transformed by purpose into someone hard and determined, willing to fight anything for Lily's sake. Michael fortified their house, not just with locks and alarms but with protective symbols he'd learned from his research, with salt lines and iron implements, with blessed objects from multiple religious traditions, creating overlapping layers of protection. They reached out to the forum parents, trying to identify other families with Thorn babies approaching their 7th year. They found 11 families, and slowly, carefully, they built a network, sharing information and strategies, preparing together for Halloween nights when they would all face the same terrible choice. Some families wanted no part of it, terrified of confronting the beings they'd bargained with. But 7 families agreed to try, to open their homes as sanctuaries, to shelter whatever children came seeking refuge. Lily continued her nightly disappearances, continued accumulating marks and trauma, continued slowly transforming into something that was less human with each passing day. But Caroline and Michael held on to hope, the fragile belief that they could save her, that Margaret's success could be replicated, that love and determination might be enough to break contracts made in desperation and signed in ignorance. October 31st of Lily's 7th year arrived with a storm, cold rain lashing Salem and keeping the usual Halloween crowds indoors. Caroline and Michael had prepared as much as possible. Their house was a fortress of protection, stocked with food and medical supplies, every room marked with symbols from various protective traditions, every entrance reinforced and blessed and watched. Lily had been strange all day, more alert than usual, her dark eyes watching her parents with something that might have been concern or might have been anticipation. She hadn't spoken more than a few words in her entire life, but that afternoon, as sunset approached, she looked at Caroline and said clearly, in a voice that sounded too old for her age, that the others were coming, that they needed help, that tonight was when everything changed. At sunset, instead of her usual 3:33 a.m. disappearance, Lily vanished immediately, pulled into whatever realm she visited nightly, but this time for the extended Halloween visitation that would last until dawn. The house felt emptier than usual, charged with waiting, and Caroline and Michael stood watch, knowing that before the night was over, their daughter would return, and she wouldn't be alone. The first child appeared at 9 p.m., materializing in the living room, a boy of about 6, covered in the same marks and symbols as Lily, wild-eyed and terrified, speaking in a jumble of English and something else, something that hurt to hear. Caroline gathered him up, wrapped him in blankets, gave him food and water, held him while he shook and cried. Michael checked the protection symbols around the house, making sure they were intact, preparing for whatever was coming. More children appeared throughout the evening, each one emerging from nothing, each one marked and traumatized, each one seeking the sanctuary that somehow they knew was available here. By midnight, there were 17 children in the Hartwell house, ranging in age from 4 to 7, all Thorn babies approaching or reaching the age when they were supposed to be claimed permanently. Some were calm, some were hysterical, some were disturbingly silent, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. But as the parents held firm, as more adults arrived to help protect the children, as the house filled with voices shouting defiance and love and refusal to surrender, something began to change. The marks on the children's skin started to fade, the glowing dimmed, the pull toward the entities weakened, and the children began to calm, their screaming turning to whimpers and then to silence. The entities realized they were losing, and their fury intensified. They couldn't physically breach the protections, but they tried everything else: illusions of the house burning, visions of individual children suffering horribly, threats of eternal consequences, promises of rewards if the parents would just let go, just allow the contracts to be fulfilled, just accept that these children had never been entirely human and could never be saved. But the parents held on. Caroline looked at these 17 children, and they were all her children in that moment. Michael saw them all as his responsibility, these innocent beings who had never asked to be created as bridges between worlds. The other parents who had come to help recognized their own desperation in every child's face, saw their own miracle babies in every marked body, and refused to let these entities claim even one of them. At 3:45 a.m., the moment when visitation was contractually supposed to end, the entities made one final, desperate attempt. They offered new deals, better terms, promises that the children could live mostly human lives if the parents would just acknowledge the entity's partial ownership, if they would just allow occasional visitation, if they would just compromise instead of fighting for complete severance. Caroline spoke for all of them when she refused. These children weren't property to be shared or traded. They weren't half-human beings subject to supernatural custody arrangements. They were children, period, and they deserved to be protected and loved without conditions or compromises. Whatever role the entities had played in their conception didn't give those beings rights over their souls or their futures. As sunrise approached, the entities began to fade, their forms becoming less solid, their voices quieter. The contracts had been broken not through legal loopholes or magical counterspells, but through simple refusal to honor their terms, through parents choosing to protect children who weren't biologically theirs, through love extended beyond blood relation to encompass all the innocent beings who had been caught in these terrible bargains. By dawn, the entities were gone, and the children were free. The marks on their skin had vanished completely. The pull toward the other realm had ceased. They were still unusual children, still carried memories of places they shouldn't have been, still had abilities and sensitivities that marked them as having been touched by something beyond normal reality. But they were human enough now, freed from the nightly visitations and the looming threat of permanent claiming. The days following that Halloween were chaotic. 17 children needed to be returned to their biological families, assuming those families wanted them back. Some parents had fled during the night, too terrified to face the entities, and had essentially abandoned their children to whatever fate awaited them. Other parents had stood firm in their own homes but had lost the battle, had watched their children disappear permanently, and were now dealing with grief and guilt in equal measure. She began to speak more, though what she said was often disturbing. She described the realm where she'd been taken every night, a vast network of caverns and tunnels that existed beneath reality, populated by entities that fed on human emotion and potential, that used children as conduits to experience existence in the physical world. The children taken there were kept in a state between living and dead, conscious but controlled, used as vessels through which the entities could vicariously experience human sensation. The marks that had covered Lily and the other children had been identification symbols, brands indicating which entity had primary claim on each child. The scratches and injuries hadn't been punishments but the natural result of existing partially in a realm where physical laws didn't work the same way, where bodies that were meant for three-dimensional space had to compress into geometries that human anatomy couldn't properly accommodate. Dr. Lazarus Thorne, or whatever used that name, was revealed to be a broker, a being that existed between worlds, facilitating contracts between desperate humans and entities that wanted access to human children. The Thorn entity had been doing this for centuries, maybe millennia, helping childless couples conceive in exchange for partial custody that would eventually become full ownership. It was a long-term harvesting operation, slow and patient, taking children one at a time rather than in bulk, staying beneath the notice of anyone who might have the power to stop it. Caroline and Michael tried to find other Thorn families, tried to warn couples who might be considering similar fertility treatments, tried to expose the pattern so that no one else would fall into the trap they had. But Drive, the other children who had been saved that Halloween night, faced similar challenges. They formed a community of their own, staying in touch through Caroline's coordination, supporting each other through the unique traumas they shared. They called themselves the Borrowed Children, recognizing that they had been conceived through supernatural means and marked by darkness but had been saved by the refusal of parents to accept that bargain. Some of the children adjusted better than others. A few managed relatively normal lives, their unusual abilities minor enough to hide or explain away. Others struggled profoundly, unable to fully connect with human society, plagued by memories of the realm they'd visited nightly for years, occasionally slipping back into the behaviors and perspectives they'd learned in that dark place.